Hello, everybody. Happy Earth Week. Welcome to WOTS Weekly Features. Today, we are featuring author and public policy researcher Seth Klein in conversation with ECW's senior editor, Jen Knoch. If you're ready for a realistic but optimistic take on how we can heal climate change, you're in the right place. I get the special privilege today of sitting back and listening with the rest of you as these two discuss Seth's recent release, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. WOTS Toronto operates on land that is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabe and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land you live on, wherever you're tuning in from. So your host for the day is Jen Knoch. Hello there. Jen is the senior editor at ECW Press, where she edits fiction and nonfiction. She also writes the newsletter 5 Minutes for the Planet, which presents big eco issues in small doses to help us all become better climate citizens. She will be interviewing Seth Klein. Hello, Seth. Seth is the founding British Columbia director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives for over 2 decades and has been immersed in climate change and inequality issues for his whole working life. He is currently an adjunct professor in urban studies at Simon Fraser University and remains a research associate with the CCPA. And he lives in Vancouver, BC. Hello there. So great to have both of you on. I cannot wait to listen to this, so I'm going to just remove myself and sit back and relax. So have a wonderful conversation.
Hi, Jen.
Anna. Hi, Seth. So I had the pleasure of working on your book approximately 1 million years ago when the pandemic was young. And it was a real privilege, even at that fraught time.
Thank you for all of your editing of the book.
My pleasure. In my spare time, I read a lot of books about climate change because I like to party.
You're my kind of people.
And I think I literally counted, and I think I read 17 books last year, including yours, which is why I drink, definitely. But as we were kind of saying with Santa just now, that one thing that I really appreciated about your book was that it made me feel a genuine hopefulness, and not because you're Pollyanna and you tell us everything's going to be fine and we got this, but rather because of how thorough your analysis is. I think your policy background really shows in this book, not in a boring way, guys.
Yeah, don't scare people off.
But instead in its thoroughness and how well thought out it is. And also because you make such good use of World War II as instructive for our current situation with climate change. So I thought we could maybe get started and explore a little why the Second World War and why it's such a good comparison for climate action today.
Well, I think it works as a comparison at many levels. First of all, it works, I would say, because like with climate, it too starts with a period of denial. All emergencies start with a period of denial, right? We can all remember a little over a year ago, we were all in denial, hearing little bits about this new virus and wondering, but completely, not coming to terms with what it was all going to mean to our lives. And that was true in the late 1930s too, where our government and much of the public was deeply reluctant to accept what we were about to have to do. And so we find ourselves today. A second comparison is that the climate and the war were both existential threats. And they both require a true cross-society mobilization. But as you were alluding to, the more I dug into that research, the wartime research, the more I also found it a really inspiring example. What led me to initially explore that World War II example is that I had long been intrigued by the war as this positive model for the fact that we had quickly transformed our economy before. In fact, we did it twice during the war, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. And so for all of us who wonder, can we really do this at the speed and scale required? That story tells us that we can, because we have.
there's a fact in the book, which I forgive me, don't know off by heart, but the number of planes that we made pre-wartime compared to the number that we were able to generate during wartime, and those kinds of, which like, it's exponentially more.
Yeah.
Those kinds of transitions are really inspiring because it's not that gradual improvement. It's this sudden spike and ramp up.
Completely.
What we need here. Completely.
Yeah. Before World War II, Canada had virtually nothing in the way of military production. On the airplanes question, I can't remember the figure either, but it was, you counted in the 2 or 3 dozens a year. But by the end of the Second World War, Canada had produced about over 16,000 military aircraft and produced the 4th largest air force in the world, 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, over 700 ships. So the speed and scale was jaw-dropping.
It's truly, I think that's one of the things that just continues to resonate as we go on. It's a really inspired across society cooperation, mobilization, and yeah, that's exactly what we need here.
And this is what gravitated me to it is, as you mentioned off the top, I've spent years working with this material, but there was something about digging into that history and trying to excavate that story that jolted my own thinking about how one approaches an emergency. It made me look with fresh eyes at the issue before us now.
So let's pull from your book a couple of those World War II informed strategies that should be high priority items when we're tackling climate change.
Well, it's funny. I've done a lot of book events in September, and this question always comes up, right? Like, how do you know from that wartime experience when a government is actually in emergency mode? And I've tried to distill this 400-page book into what I call my 4 markers of emergency mode. And they are: you spend what it takes to win, you create new economic institutions to get the job done, you move from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed, and 4th, you tell the truth. You tell the truth about the gravity of the situation and what we're going to have to do to confront it. We did all those things in the war. I would actually say the government's hitting all 4 of those markers, to greater or lesser extent with respect to the pandemic. And we hit none of those markers yet with respect to the climate emergency. But, when you look at the wartime lessons, government spending increased tenfold during the war to meet that moment. C.D. Howe, who was the cabinet minister who oversaw all of this wartime ramp up, famously said when he was pressed about this unprecedented ramp up in spending, if we lose the war, nothing will matter, which is, I think, the right mindset. And, while he was a private sector guy and he, was happy to give contracts to the private sector to build all of this stuff, he was in a hurry. And so anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed to be done, he created another crown corporation. He created 28 crown corporations during the war to get that job done. So that gives you some indication of what it would look like today.
I want to go back to that first point, which is spending what it takes, spending what needs to be spent. We just had our first budget in 2 years come down yesterday afternoon. I'm sure you haven't had time to page through all 800 pages yet, but
but I've read all the climate pages.
I figured you would have been reading those climate pages. So what do you think of that $8.75 billion over the next 5 years? How far is that going to get us?
So first of all, it's I would invite everyone to take the headline numbers that they're hearing about all of the spending on climate with a lump of salt. There's always a lot of mischief made where they give these big dollar amounts, but they're spread out over 7 or 10 years. So as I walked through the actual tables, it looks to me, when you add it all up, that the federal government is spending and planning to spend over the next 3 to 5 years something in the order of $3.5 to $4 billion a year on climate. That's nowhere near enough. So they're not spending a little less than they should. They're spending less by a massive order of magnitude. Just last week for my column at the National Observer, I tried to take the Biden announcement and convert it into the Canadian context. So, divide it by 10, given the relative sizes of the economy, turn it into Canadian dollars, annualize it. And it looks to me like if you were to convert what Biden is proposing to the Canadian context, it would be about 25 billion a year. If we were to do what Nicholas Stern says we should do and spend 2% of GDP on this fight, we would be spending about 50 billion a year. That's what it would look like to spend what it takes to win. So we got a long way to go yet.
I love those conversions. I love numbers like that. And also, like, it's worth pointing out that, that the Biden plan still might not be good enough. The Biden plan isn't our dunk on climate change. It's just the most ambitious policy that we've seen.
From the US, and it certainly makes what the Trudeau government is proposing just pale in comparison.
Despite all the big talk.
Yeah, well, this is the awkward period in which we live. And to come back to the World War II metaphor, the first 9 months of the Second World War were called by historians the phony war. We declared war, but not a lot happened initially. This is our phony war period, where our governments declare a climate emergency, but the zeitgeist hasn't shifted. They're not there yet, but they will.
I'm just hoping. We talked a bit about COVID, and COVID is really relevant. It was quite something for COVID to come along as you were finishing up the writing of this book, and even then having to try and predict how COVID might affect the climate effort. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what you think now, not quite, probably a year after you had to finish writing almost, and over a year into this pandemic, and how do you think the COVID response has either helped or hindered our climate effort?
Well, it does both. And we'll see in the end which wins out. But first of all, to your point about the awkward timing, as you remember, because you were one of the editors dealing with it. I wrote the whole book before the pandemic. I wrote it all in 2019 in a single year. And I had handed it off for final copy edit to you folks 3 days before the first lockdown. And I got really thrown at first because I thought, the whole presumption of the book was that we needed this historic example of how quickly we're capable of pivoting. And then here we all were living it in real time. So I ended up quickly writing an epilogue. I consciously didn't touch the book, the content of the book, in light of COVID, because then that would have been a real rabbit hole.
Thank you.
But instead, I just decided to write a new epilogue about COVID. But as you say, even when I wrote it, it was still, 2-3 months into the thing. I've tried to update it a little bit on my website. But my takeaway is this. The bad news is the pandemic pushes everything else off the front burner. And that's too bad because momentum was really building. The September before the pandemic, we had these student-led strike days. We had the largest single day of protest in Canadian history. We had these solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en a month before the lockdown, which were unlike anything we've ever seen as a country. So momentum was really building, and we have to recoup that now. On balance, though, I'm someone who believes that the pandemic, in an odd way, sets us up well for what we now need to do. We now have an example of how quickly we can change everything. The level of public spending in response to the pandemic has laid bare this false promise we've dealt with for decades, right? Whenever we were told there was not enough money to tackle climate or homelessness or poverty, it turns out when a government actually recognizes an emergency as an emergency, the money is always there. And now we need to hold on to that. I think we come out of the pandemic, notwithstanding our fumbles and this is not universally true, but I think we come out of it with an improved sense of social solidarity, improved respect for science and scientists, a greater appreciation for the role of public services and government. And, those are all helpful ingredients.
It really gives us a sense of the way that we need to combine both this governmental systemic transformation and leadership with the individual actions that we do every day. We wear our masks, we go get our vax, all of those things. And And that's something that I wanted to draw out a little bit more, because your book really does emphasize that this is the government's problem to solve, that it needs to start with leadership. We need to do this on a vast systemic level. And I'm sure that is a tremendous relief to many of us who are like in agony over what kind of toothbrush we use, or a reprieve from oil companies asking us what we're going to do about our climate footprints. But I also don't think what you're saying is that this is a free pass to ignore climate work and to just live your own life. So my question is, how can us individuals be good soldiers and a good warrior?
Well, first of all, your point about mask wearing is an interesting one, right? It speaks to my marker number 3, move from voluntary to mandatory. The mask thing is an interesting one, because I think that's another example of the public being ahead of our politics and saying to our governments, make it mandatory already. Where are you? And that's, of course, not happened yet on climate. Part of why I think that dynamic occurs, and it's a good one, is that in the main, whether it's the pandemic or climate, most of us want to do the right thing. But it irks us, because nobody wants to be a chump, to think that we'll do the right thing and our neighbor won't, right? That's the great thing about moving from voluntary to mandatory. You don't need to worry about your neighbor. Your neighbor's not going to have a choice. They're going to have to do it too. And so you're quite right that I am on this question of individual versus collective. So first of all, the premise of my book is that climate, like war, is an inherently collective undertaking. We cannot solve this alone. But you're also right that it's not a free pass. We all need to do what we need to do to change how we get around and fuel swap our homes and all of those things. I've done those things. And yet I am convinced that if we are relying on everyone to voluntarily do these things, we're fried. And we never would have left it that way in the war. So that means on the question of what individuals can do, there's all those individual things you can and should do. But mostly, this is a political endeavor. What we individually need to do is take political action in the ways we feel comfortable, to protest, to engage in peaceful civil disobedience, if that's where you're at, to divest, to pressure and cajole and harangue our political leaders to move into emergency mode and adopt those 4 markers. Support true climate champions who are seeking office, or become one yourself. This is a political moment. Yeah, I think that's what we need to do.
I love that. So if you're going to spend your 10 minutes on saving the world today, that maybe a great use of that time would be writing a letter to your representative, or writing a letter to the editor, or sending money. And don't worry if your dental floss is biodegradable too much. I mean,
exactly.
And to be fair, that's something that I write about a lot, is the choices that we can make to make our lives a little bit more in line with these goals. But I think it's should come as a relief that ultimately the best thing we can do is not on any one of us. It's not even on our family or our city. It's something that we all need to do together. So whatever we can do to get more people on board is going to be the most effective climate action there is.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me just see. We're almost out of time, but I'm going to sneak in one last question, which is something that I always like to talk about in terms of climate, which is that climate work is hard. You know this. There's lots of big bad data. There's lots of terrible photos of icebergs calving. There's all of the things that can lead us down the path of despair. And so in this work that you do as an activist and as policy critic, what keeps you going? What is the thing how do you manage that despair, or how do you find hope?
Well, first of all, yeah, I'm glad you're asking this at the end, and you're bringing us full circle from where you started around the hopefulness of the book, and I'm glad you find it hopeful. The truth is, I'm trying to walk a careful line, as leaders did in World War II, which is to be honest and forthright about the gravity of the situation, and yet still impart some hope. The truth is that none of us who follow the science can do so without wrestling with despair. we're all walking a razor's edge as we wrestle with this stuff. And we need to be honest and forthright about that too. But here's the solace I pulled from the story in my book, the World War II story in my book. You never know. And the speed and scale can be extraordinary. And just to leave you with this thought and a final statistic, if you will, in the Second World War, Canada was a population a little over 11 million people, less than a third the size we are today. Out of that, over 1 million enlisted into service. That is an extraordinary statistic, isn't it, in terms of a level of mobilization? But you know what they didn't know, that 1 million plus people, is if they would win. Right? I'm stating the obvious, but we forget because we know how the story ended, but they didn't. And there was a good chunk of the war's early years in which the outcome was uncertain. And they did it anyway. And in the process, they surprised themselves by what they were capable of accomplishing at home and abroad, and the speed and scale of the transformation of Canadian society that they achieved. And maybe that ambiguity has to be enough for now.
We don't fight because we know we'll win. We'll fight because we know it's worthwhile, right? Yeah. So
I'm getting emotional back here. This has been so great. Thank you both so much for spending some time with us. Really appreciate it. Everybody at home, please go. You can visit ecwpress.com, or you can go directly to Seth's website, sethklein.ca. There it is, .ca/book. Nice short link for you, and go take a look at this wonderful piece of writing. Thank you both so much. Really appreciate you having here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. So this has been today's WOTS Weekly Feature. Tune in on Thursday, April 22nd, our Earth Day this year, for a conversation about sustainable and resilient cities with Mariko Uda. For discounts and deals, you can check out toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca/weekly-features. This has been today. Thank you so much. Enjoy your day and happy Earth Week.